Well, we are, of course, almost there, right? Almost there. And in these weeks of Advent, we've been looking and preparing and getting ready, thinking about the hopes and the expectations of who Jesus would be. And I wanted to look this morning at one last topic, one last theme, particularly from the book of Isaiah, as we're looking at Isaiah's hopes and dreams of who the coming one, Jesus, would be. And this is a common experience that he's searching for. It's something that I think at different points in all of our lives that we wonder about, we wrestle with. And that's a deeper relationship with God. Some connection, some sense of God's presence. I think there are different times in our lives when we want to feel that deeper relationship with God. Sometimes it's in the midst of joys. Things are going great in our life, and we just feel like that awe, that amazing sense of God's presence. Let me give you an example. I often wonder about this, about a young person who, a young adult, I should say, who probably doesn't maybe think about God, or maybe even says, you know what, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God at all. But then they have their first child, and they're holding their baby, and those who've had that experience, you're just overcome with love, and they're just so connected, and they find themselves going, thank you, God. Oh, wait a minute. I don't believe in God. I don't think about God, but holding this wonderful child, I'm drawn to the holy. And for some people, that's the beginning of a journey of faith. They didn't used to be connected or think about faith, but they know this child, this wonderful celebration, is a gift from God. Sometimes it's in good times. We want a deeper connection with God. Sometimes it's in hard times. We want a deeper connection with God. It might be in the midst of broken relationships. Sometimes at this time of year, we're a little bit more aware of being on the outs with some friends or family. Sometimes it happens in dating or marriage relationships. I was just having a conversation the other day with a couple kind of struggling a little bit at this time of year. Sometimes in those challenging moments, and this couple reached out to the church, a pastor, to kind of get a little bit of advice, a little bit of God connection in the midst of their challenges. Or it could be physical challenges when we sometimes want a deeper connection with God. You know, we think everything's going along well, and then we visit the doctor, and the doctor goes, I don't like some of those tests. We're going to do some more. And you get a little worried about how things are going. Sometimes we have those physical ailments. Somebody was just telling me the other day, was talking about their need for a joint replacement. They said, you know, everything would be kind of fine, but every once in a while they would step in just the right way, and this searing pain would come, and they were like, that's not good. You know, we have physical ailments, and sometimes in the midst of those kinds of challenges, we reach out for a connection with God. Or it could be in times of mourning or grief or difficulty. When challenges come, sometimes we reach out to God. Sometimes it's looking for guidance. You know, we're trying to find our way in the world, trying to find our path, some sense of purpose, why it is that we are here on the earth. And sometimes in the midst of that wrestling, we look for some guidance, some sense of connection with God, some higher power to help guide us along the way. There are often these times when we're searching and we're wanting that deeper connection with God. And as I mentioned, in the book of Isaiah, we hear Isaiah dreaming about God's presence. We've looked, by the way, at the topic of peace. He desired peace. At the topic of leadership. Last week we looked at healing, and I wanted to mention that as well. Last Sunday, the second service got a message. We all got to enjoy at this service the choir concert. If you want a match set of all the hopes and dreams of Isaiah, that one's online. They'll miss this morning's sermon because the children have a program. But last week was healing, and now God's presence. So let's listen to Isaiah dream about God's presence. We'll find that in Isaiah, the 7th chapter, and it starts, "Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz." A reminder, Ahaz is one of the kings of Israel. I know when I was talking about leadership before, Ahaz was not a good king. Frustrated Isaiah. And so we hear this about King Ahaz. God says, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. I will be connected with you. I will give you a sign. Let it be as deep as Sheol." Sheol is the place of the dead. So as deep as you can go, I'll give you a sign, or as high as heaven. So God is saying to Ahaz, anywhere in the whole breadth, from the bottom to the top, I'll give you whatever sign you want, Ahaz. But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." Now, we would think at first, this is like, oh, this is a good thing. He's not wanting to test God. But we know from all the things that Isaiah wrote about Ahaz, it isn't a sense of faith in Ahaz that he says, I don't need to test you, God. It's from a sense that I got it covered. I don't need you, God. I will work out the things that I need to work out. That's okay, God. I got it covered, is Ahaz's attitude. So then Isaiah, the prophet, says, "Hear then, O house of David, hear, Ahaz. Is it too little for you to weary mortals? You are driving all your subjects crazy, but you're going to weary God also?" And then Isaiah continues, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign." You're not going to ask for a sign, but you're going to get a sign. "And it shall be that a young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." And Emmanuel means God with us. Isaiah is saying that there is, and it sounds like already, a young woman who is going to have a child. He may, Isaiah, be referring to the next king. We do know in the history of kings, the one who followed Ahaz was Hezekiah, and he was much more faith-oriented. It may be that another prophet is coming, but Isaiah's prophecy is that already your replacement, someone to rebuke you, is coming. And Emmanuel means God with us, this promise of God with us. He goes on to describe this child. "He shall eat curds and honey," a way to say solid foods. As a child, we know today would be, that rice cereal. But by the time this child is eating solid foods, he will know how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, so in a short period of time, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. That refers to the political alliances that Ahaz is creating. You won't have to worry about problems from countries like Syria, because we know historically Assyria and Babylon would come and even defeat those kingdoms. But most have pointed to and been intrigued by this sense of a child who will be called God with us. In the New Testament lesson, Matthew picks up on this theme as well, of a child who is God with us. That is the largest part, in fact, of what we celebrate at this time of year. God with us. Think about that a little bit in terms of our waiting for Christmas. There is something uniquely special about this time of year. It's a time of the year people who aren't even faith-oriented, the radio stations who aren't even normally faith-oriented, start playing Christmas carols, and there's just that something special at this time of year. I remember thinking this a number of years ago now. I went to visit a man in my first congregation out in Ohio. His name was Milton, and unfortunately, Milton had very severe Alzheimer's. I didn't know him before he got ill, and the only real thing that I really knew about him is that he had been a railroader. He wore a railroad cap every day, and someone had told me that he had been a railroader. But his dementia was so poor that he could literally not keep a train of thought for more than a second or two. He liked to talk, but he would constantly say things like, and then the other thing, and oh, by the way, and then that happened, and he would say things like that one after another. It was like a transition from one sentence to the next constantly. It was difficult to visit Milton. And I remember on one particular visit, it was around this time of year, and it was hard to have a conversation with him, but I said to him, Milton, do you know what time of year it is? And he didn't know. I said, Christmas is coming. I said, do you remember the Christmas story? And of course, he didn't know. So I started to tell him the Christmas story. The story of the prophecies and the hopes and dreams of waiting for Jesus. The story of the angel coming to Mary and her deep faith in what was to unfold. The story of Joseph and his trust of God's plans. The story of Jesus being born in the manger. The story of the simple shepherds arriving and then the wise men traveling, following the star. And as I told Milton this story, tears ran down his face. He couldn't remember the story, but when he heard the story, there was something deeply touching in the midst of that. There is something special at this time of year, that God would come and be with us. It's kind of like that old Native American theme, which I found the other day as I was researching it, is not actually a Native American theme. It's from a poem called Judge Softly by Mary Lathrop in 1895 that she wrote about walking a mile in someone else's moccasins. That idea of being in somebody else's life, or for me, the place that I love that idea the best is in the old classic book and then the movie, To Kill a Mockingbird. If you know that story, they invite over the family little Walter Cunningham, who's very poor. And Walter Cunningham takes syrup and he pours it all over his meal, because he's probably used to hiding the flavor. And little Jean Louise, little scout, starts to, what are you doing? And she gets reprimanded by the housekeeper and her father. And her father teaches her that you will get along much better in life if you can step in someone else's shoes, if you can walk a mile in their shoes or step into their skin. And that's, of course, what we celebrate in the Christmas story. That not just a mile, but a lifetime, God stepped into our shoes in Jesus. That's the joy. God with us. That no matter what we experience, God knows that. God was in the midst of this as well. When we go through good times, Jesus did as well. Think about those stories of Jesus gathering children to himself and blessing them. He must have had a giant smile on his face. Or when he got to heal someone, Jesus knew joy. And so when we experience times of joy, God knows that. God is with us through Jesus. And when we go through hard times, when our relationships are broken, Jesus experienced this as well. We hear in the Gospels about how sometimes his followers turned and left him. God is with us in those times, and of course, Jesus even knew that in one of his key 12 disciples, Judas. When we go through physical challenges, God is with us. You know, Jesus walked everywhere. I'm sure at the end of his day, his feet were sore, just like ours are. God is with us. And of course, when Jesus went to the cross, he knew suffering and pain, as we sometimes do as well. And when we seek guidance and we want a sense of connection with God and a direction, we see that as well in Jesus' life. We see him coming into his mission at times, seeming to learn things from people that he interacts with, like a faithful non-Jewish woman. And Jesus seems to change his mind and his direction. And even at the end, Jesus wrestles with the path that God has given him, but sets his course where God directs. When we are lost and we are trying to figure out what it is that God wants us to do, God is with us. That's the wonderful joy of this time of year. It's God's way of saying, I know everything that you experience. Isaiah had a dream in his day of a child who would be God with us. But what came to be long after the time of Isaiah is much better than he could have ever imagined. Jesus is truly God with us. And as we prepare to celebrate that again this week, feel that sense of God with us. Amen.